Afternoon, everyone. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education, and I'm joining you from the occupied lands of the Ohlone people in the East Bay of California. We encourage all our participants on this call located in the Bay Area to pay their Shumi land tax, which you can do by following the link in the chat. The chat will be disabled for these calls, except for us to share information with the audience. If you have questions you'd like to get answered during the call, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try our best to answer them there. In that same toolbar, you can find the CC button to enable closed captioning. We're also grateful to have ASL interpreters on hand throughout this call. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. So today's agenda is as follows. First, we'll start with the report back on Wednesday's action at SFO and an update on the legal case of the Bay Bridge 78 from Annie Banks of APTP. Then, and as always, Samer Arabi from AROC will join us to share updates and analysis on political developments internationally and in the US. And finally, we're honored to have a special guest, Palestinian human rights lawyer, legal scholar, and activist Noura Erakat, to assess international law and its critical importance to the situation in Palestine historically and in this current acceleration of Israel's aggression and occupation in Gaza. Thanks again for joining us today, and please, as always, keep up the fight to free Palestine. With that, let's bring up Annie Banks. Annie, great to have you. Last November, protesters took over the Bay Bridge in one of the most significant demonstrations to stop business as usual in American life at the start of the current genocide in Gaza. And there have been several more shutdowns and shutdown actions here and across the country since. And this week we had another one. A group of comrades took over SFO to continue the fight to raise consciousness and ensure the American public and our electeds are engaged and responsive to the demand for a ceasefire. Tell us a little bit more about what happened this week.
Thanks so much, Thomas. I'm glad to be here. On Wednesday, March 13th, over 300 people from different groups came together and shut down the international terminal of the San Francisco airport under the banner Stop the World for Gaza. On the 2-week anniversary of the Flower Massacre, protesters demanded that President Biden call for a permanent ceasefire and to stop arming Israel. This escalation comes after months of protests, shutdowns, rallies, and campaigns in response to the ongoing genocide in Gaza being committed by Israel and the U.S. At SFO on Wednesday, community members shut down the international terminal, forcing passengers to be rerouted to other gates and causing delays of flights. The airport also redirected people to being dropped off due to the curb and traffic lanes being blocked. Multiple flights to Israel were expected to leave on Wednesday from this terminal. The various areas were blocked both by people, cars, visual installations like a replication Red Crescent ambulance that was accompanied by a large crowd of health workers, and also with banners that said, "Stop the World for Gaza," "Permanent Ceasefire Now," and "Stop Arming Israel." There were also musicians playing music and people chanting on megaphones, both inside and outside the terminal. People in the groups present spoke to media there, sharing that, as people of conscience, it's a necessity for us to take action to stop this escalating genocide. And some passengers also showed their support, including a person who got on a bullhorn to express that she supported the protest and didn't mind being inconvenienced because at least I am living, in her words. You can see, and we'll share some links, but the video of her speaking, I found pretty moving that people, felt so moved to get on the bullhorn. Several other passengers put up their fists in support or cheered on the protests, while several others attempted to push back past the lines of protesters blocking entry or exit points or express their frustration verbally at the groups of people. The shutdown at SFO lasted for 158 minutes, 1 minute for each day of the genocide. After the group successfully reached this goal, they dispersed and there were no arrests, though several drivers were cited and cars were towed and impounded for blocking traffic. San Francisco was one of 10 cities across the world in response to the global call to stop the world for Gaza and to call for no business as usual while the genocide in Gaza continues. Other cities included Buenos Aires, Prague, London, Ottawa, and Los Angeles, where community members shut down the intersection of the Wilshire Federal Building in LA. We must continue to resist, disrupt, and shut it down. Directly following Wednesday, we've seen further actions this week alone, including a shutdown of the distribution of the New York Times by over 400 New Yorkers. And also yesterday, Thursday, March 14th, a movement victory took place for the Bay Bridge 78, a group of 78 community members in the Bay Area who have been prosecuted for taking action in November 2023. Now I'm quoting from the Bay Bridge 78 Defense Committee's Instagram post about yesterday's victory. While Biden was hosting cocktail parties in San Francisco during APEC, with Biden visiting SF, hundreds of people shut down the Bay Bridge to demand an immediate ceasefire, the end of U.S. military aid to Israel, and a free Palestine. District Attorney Brooke Jenkins and her racist office ruthlessly charged protesters for their civil disobedience to stop the genocide in Gaza, which continues to rage on due to increasing U.S. funding, fueling the massacres against our people. Today, the Bay Bridge 78 accepted diversion under the condition that they avoid arrest for 2 months, upon which the case will be officially dismissed. And now I'm going to read the official statement from the Bay Bridge 78. Today marks an end to the SF District Attorney's malicious prosecution of Bay Bridge ceasefire protesters. Your support, including thousands of letters, calls, and emails, successfully pressured the DA to go from pursuing maximum charges to offering diversion. The Bay Bridge 78 accepted diversion today, which will end the case under the condition that we avoid arrest for the next 2 months. We claim this as a collective victory and an opportunity to renew our solidarity with Palestine. Our commitment to Palestine is greater than our fear of the state. Let us be clear, this is no admission of guilt. We concede nothing. Rather, this was a strategic decision to free ourselves as quickly as possible in order to keep organizing. We are eager to refocus our energy on fighting this genocide rather than on defending ourselves in court. DA Jenkins' actions have already come at great cost to us: intense stress, workplace retaliation, targeted harassment, and an enormous strain on time and resources. For Palestinians of the Bay Bridge 78, these burdens have been especially cruel. To prosecute those who are protesting against the systemic decimation of their own people, including the killing of their own family members, is disturbing and reprehensible. When we took action in November, Israel had killed upwards of 15,000 Palestinians. Today, that number has more than doubled to well over 30,000 killed. Conditions grow increasingly horrific by the hour. Israel and the U.S. want our attention to fade away while they expedite their mission to completely erase all traces of Palestinian life, and we cannot let them do so uncontested. From the Bay to Palestine, we have an obligation to resist genocide, especially when it is funded by our tax dollars. The case against us was always a political one, meant to provoke a chilling effect on pro-Palestine organizing and protest movements more broadly. Because of your solidarity, it failed to accomplish a guilty verdict or intimidate us into silence. Thank you. This victory is not about our exceptionalism. Rather, it represents the growing strength of this movement. For over 75 years, Palestinians have shown us what it means to remain steadfast in our resistance. We are honored to learn from this legacy. That's the end of their statement. And I'll close by just saying, if you're looking to take action, we encourage you to look into joining a local organization, connecting with your trusted people who also want to take action, and digging into some of the great resources available from groups like the Ruckus Society and more that we'll share here. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. And thank you to the organizers, both of the Bay Bridge 78 action and this past week's action, and all those especially who have risked arrest and put themselves on the line to call and demand for ceasefire. Now let's bring up Samar Arabi from AROC to share some analysis of key developments on the ground and in politics this week. Samar, we mentioned this last week, but the holy month of Ramadan has begun, with Palestinians having iftar meals on makeshift tables amidst rubble with little to no food. And we have a lot of questions. How likely are we going to see a Rafah offensive? Is there any movement in ceasefire negotiations that can ward off that catastrophic possibility? What's happening with this inefficient and overly complicated port for the US military? And why are we talking about TikTok? So tell us what's going on.
Thanks, Thomas. It's great to be here as always. As you noted, there's a lot going on. Many things have happened in this past week and some really important developments, I think. So I will try to go through them at a reasonable pace. Just to say, it's been another week of pretty horrific violence. Ramadan is known as a time where the Israeli regime really ramps up the violence in Palestine generally, and obviously this year we're seeing it in a much worse way, particularly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Uh, just to note that here we are in the middle of Ramadan in this time where 5 days past the sort of deadline that the Israeli military set for when they would start their ground invasion of Rafah if there wasn't a ceasefire. And last week we talked about whether that was sort of, posturing to increase their sort of negotiating position for a ceasefire. And sure enough, that is in fact what it turned out to be. It's not looking likely that that ground offensive is happening immediately. The few statements that I've seen this past week, several reference a ground offensive in April. And so like they're pushing it out once again because, as we discussed last week, the Israeli military really doesn't want to start a bigger regional conflagration during the month of Ramadan, where things are particularly tense. And in fact, what we're seeing is they're moving soldiers from Gaza to the West Bank. They just deployed 15,000 soldiers to the West Bank, where they're doing all kinds of horrible things around holy sites, as they do every year. So I think there's more posturing here while Israel tries to secure the ceasefire. It's really funny that we're in a bit of a topsy-turvy moment where everyone is now talking about the need for a ceasefire. The Israelis and the US are now talking a lot and using the word ceasefire a lot. And as we discussed a few weeks ago, they mean something very different when they say that word. They're looking for a temporary truce, particularly to get them through the month of Ramadan, to give them a little more time to sort of organize their operations, not a cessation of hostility, like not a complete cessation of the sort of military invasion. So just this morning, actually, Hamas has once again proposed their ceasefire terms, and they're effectively unchanged from the terms that they proposed several weeks ago, which are a complete withdrawal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip, a permanent ceasefire, not a 6-week temporary truce, full exchange of prisoners, and massive influx of aid. So that continues to be the sort of red line that Hamas is holding. The other parties, the US and Israel, are shifting increasingly every week a little bit towards that point. So the main question, I think, now is how long that position can hold given the sort of catastrophic situation in Gaza as it relates to the humanitarian catastrophe that continues to worsen. We saw just this week that the director of UNRWA noted that more children have died in Gaza in the past 4 months than have been killed in every major world conflict in the past 4 years. It's obviously not just children, like all vulnerable groups, particularly the elderly, are also in a really tough spot right now. And, just to say, like, this is not just a sort of logistical consequence of the war, but rather what is very clearly a macabre negotiating tactic from the Israeli government to sort of force the hand of Hamas to accept a ceasefire that it clearly is otherwise not willing to accept in situations like this. So just to make the situation so untenable through massive civilian casualties that there has to be some sort of resolution. This is a common Israeli tactic that it has deployed in Gaza many times before and in Lebanon and other places, but obviously we're seeing the sort of distilled essence of it this time, where that like widespread starvation and widespread death now from starvation continues to sort of increase uninterrupted. Meanwhile, we're seeing, like sort of continuation of that strategy and the sort of proof that there's a design behind this starvation thing is making the provision of aid itself deadly. So, that first flower massacre that we talked about several weeks ago followed this sort of what's becoming a a playbook of the way that Israel manages its war crimes in Gaza, which is, it's the exact same storyline that we saw for Al Shifa Hospital, where, they did this giant attack. Everyone was like, oh my goodness, this is horrible. The whole world freaks out. Israel's like, no, we would never do that. Of course, that's not what happened. And once the news cycle moves on, they start doing the same thing over and over again. So we've seen now over 400 Palestinians killed waiting in aid lines. And so there's no question anymore that Israel is purposely targeting civilians trying to receive aid. And, just to note that while I was grabbing screenshots for this slide, you can even see on the left there, another aid massacre happened while I was trying to document this last aid massacre. And that one, I think now has reached up to 40 casualties already. This is just yesterday. So this like rinse and repeat, worsening aid situation has obviously led to the US trying to get involved in some weird way. There was the failed airdrops campaign that we talked about last week. And, now this Biden's commitment to everyone calls it a port, but it's like a floating pier that is designed for the distribution of aid. And we could do an entire session on this port, but just to say, I think the top lines are, it's very clearly a PR stunt that's not designed in any way to meaningfully deliver a sufficient aid, particularly when you consider the fact that it's not meant to be completed for another 2 months, which like if the US military wanted to build a floating pier, they could probably do it in a couple of days. But instead, this is a 2-month endeavor. It's costing something like $200 million when you think about how much aid that would be able to provide. So this like absurd expenditure over a ridiculous stretch of time that also will require the US to have Israel check all of the aid, which is the exact same reason why those trucks aren't getting through over the border. So by far, by orders of magnitude, the most efficient way to deliver aid into Gaza is simply putting it on a truck and driving it across the border. But Israel continues to just not allow any aid to go through that way. And so the idea that the same aid they'd be checking before it gets on a boat versus the aid that it gets on a truck is somehow different is laughable. And I think like a good encapsulation of just how laughable that is this video somebody took of all of the trucks and construction equipment that are going into Gaza to build this floating pier. So like, okay, well then the trucks can get in. And not only can the trucks get in, they can get in with all of this heavy material, which is exactly the stuff that Israel has been saying it can't let into the Gaza Strip. So it just sort of blows up the whole idea as being anything other than a sort of public gesture of caring about aid, as opposed to the actual meaningful distribution of aid, which is clearly not happening. Meanwhile, we're seeing a lot of movement, a surprising amount of movement on the idea of conditioning Israeli military aid. And so not only are we seeing an increasing call from Democratic senators and Congress people to either stop arming Israel altogether, or at least use the sort of billions of dollars in military assistance as leverage for letting in aid. Like you're seeing this come up in every single press conference now that the Biden administration is holding, that like, if you want Israel to stop blocking aid, why not use the billions of dollars we give them as leverage? And for the first time ever, Biden has sort of acceded to that idea. He actually says that he will now consider conditioning military aid to Israel, which is a very low bar, but it's not something he's ever said before. And that's actually pretty significant movement from the Biden administration. And again, reflects, I don't think his like moral compass about this, but the fact that he's now literally using the words red lines is a development. And I think it's mostly a development related to his concerns about his political futures as the sort of uncommitted vote grows, but that's something we'll come back around to. Just as a couple of examples of the extent of this, Jim McGovern spoke on the House floor, not exactly the world's most progressive, about stopping all U.S. military aid to Israel, and then confronted by Code Pink, Jerry Nadler, of all people, which if you're not familiar, again, maybe one of the most Zionist members of Congress, said, should we be sending money to Israel? And he just sort of looked very confused and said, if you had asked me a week ago, I would have definitely said we should be sending them more military assistance, but now I don't know. And so you're seeing a meaningful shift in the discourse of US politicians as it relates to military aid, but we haven't yet seen that shift meaningfully change in terms of the actual distribution of that aid. And a key place that we're seeing this fight is the Israel-Ukraine aid bill that we've been talking about every week for maybe 3 months now. And just to say very quickly, it remains stalled, but it's also now revealing a lot of the ways that the Israeli military is relying on this aid bill to be passed in the way that it's baked into Israel's military budget for the coming year. An incredible Haaretz article that I really recommend you reading talks about how Israel has so wastefully burned through all of its munitions because it's just indiscriminately using them everywhere, that it is desperately needing new ammunition in order to continue waging this war. And it can't do that without the assistance that it gets from the United States. So just to say, that sort of democratic shift is, most apparent at the level of the Biden administration itself and its like proxy mouthpieces. We saw Chuck Schumer this week and Biden talk about how Netanyahu's not a legitimate leader anymore. So they're clearly looking for a new interlocutor. So, this idea that like, oh, well, the problem here is that Netanyahu's not waging this war effectively, as opposed to like, well, actually, this is the same sort of thing the Israeli military always does. And so they're sort of lifting up, of all people, the defense minister as being the sort of more reasonable interlocutor, despite the fact that he's the one who's been actually waging the war. So again, shift in rhetoric, not a meaningful shift in the change so far of how that stuff is happening. I just want to briefly note that there were some leaked AIPAC talking points this week that you should definitely take a look at. They beggar belief. Like they literally are encouraging people to go to Congress and say people aren't starving in Gaza, which I don't know, demonstrably factually incorrect. So don't know what to do with that. And then just to say, the one thing that I think AIPAC and other folks have managed to push through this week was the TikTok ban, which, is a complicated bill that had a lot of different interests in it, not just a sort of desire to quell Palestinian speech. Although I just want to note that that is definitely a factor in how rapidly and how unanimously this bill was passed. When you consider, that people say that like TikTok made Gen Z support Palestine, whereas I think obviously that framing is incorrect. People who are able to see what's happening in Palestine are pro-Palestine, and TikTok is a reflection of that. So just to say, that continues to be an attempt to sort of stop the tide in a meaningful, like a completely ineffectual way. Just want to note extremely quickly that the uncommitted vote continues to grow, and as the uncommitted vote continues to grow, the pressure on Biden continues to increase. And I think we're seeing the shifts in Biden's policy as a result of that continuing pressure. And so Biden, everywhere he goes, is getting heckled. And that also, I think, as he worries about his reelection prospects, is meaningfully changing the way that he has to engage with this question. And then I will close, as I always do, with my list of like local things that folks should get involved with. Last week, we crossed the March primary elections off the list. And this week, thanks to Annie's update also mentioned this, we can cross the Bay Bridge 78 off the list. And, just to show that these sorts of like continued pressure tactics work, right? So every week, those calls, those meetings at the courthouse are meaningfully forcing people to sort of address the situation more directly and are meaningfully undermining attempts at repression. And like the prosecution of the Bay Bridge 78 was clearly designed to be a chilling effect to stop people from doing big actions like this. And the shutdown at SFO this week shows you that those tactics aren't working. So when people are organized and diverting their energy towards specific targets, it tends to be quite effective, even if it takes longer than people think that it would. And so please, I want to encourage you, as always, to get involved in some of those tactics going forward. Check out the AROC calendar of events to see what's happening in the Bay Area going forward. If you want to get text alerts, just text PSA to the number below, 833-633-0604. And as always, if you want more information on the stories that underlie these updates, just sign up for the Palestine Media Tracker. You can go to palmediatracker.com/sign up to get the weekly newsletter digest, which hopefully a lot of you received this morning. And I think that'll bring me to my close. Thank you so much, Thomas. It's been great to be here as always.
Thanks, Samer. Now we get to welcome our special guest for this week's call, Noura Erakat, professor of law at Rutgers University, legal scholar, organizer, and activist. She's co-director at Jadaliya, an independent e-zine of the Arab Studies Institute, and I highly recommend you take a look at their YouTube series, Gaza in Context, for deeper analysis of the situation in Palestine from preeminent scholars and experts. Noura is also the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, an extraordinary resource for anyone who wants to understand the history of Palestinian struggle, especially the integral role of international law in shaping and reshaping the physical and political boundaries of the conflict in Palestine. And I will say, as a movement lawyer of 15 years myself, it is one of the best explanations of using legal tactics in support of political movements in its introduction. So totally worth reading, even just for that. She has also been a frequent guest on U.S. international news programs to share her analysis on what's happening in occupied Palestine. Noura, thank you so much for joining us on our Friday PSA.
Thank you for having me, Thomas. And it was great to see Samed up a little earlier. We're all friends and comrades, so it's lovely to reconnect here.
Of course, yes. Laura has shared a little bit of that too, so it's wonderful to have you. Let's jump right into it. I wanted to start by asking you, for those in our movement, and we have a lot of folks who've been active in movement on this call, and a lot more that will watch this recording. For those who see the inability of international bodies to intervene in and stop the genocide, I'm thinking of the Security Council, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and have grown more disillusioned about international law or feel more justified in seeing it as solely a tool of oppression. I'm wondering if you could share your assessment of how international law has been administered during this recent stage in this decades-long conflict, and your sense about where international law's legitimacy stands after 5 months of genocidal war in Gaza. Has it changed or reinforced your perspective in any way about how legal work in this area can still be important to shifting the balance of power, especially in a situation like what we're seeing in Palestine right now?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. That's a really big question. I want to start by affirming everybody's frustration of what they're seeing. There is a certain expectation that there are international laws that govern the relationships between states, as well as the relationships between states and the way they treat their citizens and those that they are responsible for, inhabitants, even if they are not citizens. We expect that to function in a particular way. And what we've seen is that we can't stop a genocide. We can't stop a genocide that has had now, what I would say, if we can even periodize the last 5 months, almost 6 months, in the first moment, it was utter shock at what we were seeing. And so we were just getting ourselves, we were just trying to respond to that moment where we were put on the defensive, where suddenly history began on October 7th and Gaza floated in history. There was another period that was ceasefire. And I think that based on the past, this is systematic warfare against the Palestinians in Gaza. And so based on past iterations, I think in that moment of ceasefire, there was hope, at least on my part, and relief that this would be the end, and that the conversation was shifting to one about who do we describe as hostages and why are there some 5,000 prisoners in Israeli captivity without, several thousand without charge or trial. The third period is the one where we see the law mobilized by the Republic of South Africa, even though many different entities had mobilized the law up until this point, including, individual initiatives, ones like I was a part of that filed petitions at the International Criminal Court, or CCR filing a lawsuit within a U.S. district court against Biden, Blinken, and Austin. But this ICG case was monumental. And in this moment, there was a tremendous amount of hope because finally somebody, a nation, a country was doing something for the Palestinians. After what we had seen up until that moment, 2 vetoes in the Security Council, and the fact that really nothing has changed, but in fact has gotten worse since then. That now not only do we have a violation of the provisional orders that have been issued by the ICJ, but it's gone further, where, you know, one of the provisional orders, for those who have seen, who've paid attention to the ruling itself, is that humanitarian aid and access shall not be impeded. Not only has that aid been impeded, including by Israeli civilians who have blocked it and blocked trucks at the border, but we have seen 18 countries defund UNRWA, the primary distribution and aid agency within the Gaza Strip. We have seen now more recently Palestinians starve to death and babies die of dehydration. And we've seen the military launch several massacres, including yesterday in Gaza City at the Kuwait roundabout. That was the second attack at an aid center and this is in the north, right? In Gaza City, which has been dismantled. But two massacres in 1 week of starving Palestinians seeking aid. And so I would say, just adding, you know, before this moment, just like the relationship between the amount of the correlation between the hope, tremendous amount of hope that people placed in the ICJ at a moment where the Security Council felt like it was hopeless because of the US veto, where no other countries were mobilizing, where the ICJ actually said something positive. And then this moment in this, you know, where it's just now blatant. We're just going to massacre. It's a killing spree. I mean, it's genocidal. Genocide doesn't, you know, necessarily even capture the cruelty and the gross nature of it. And so I just want to affirm how frustrating that is. But I think that, you know, that being said, that has to do a lot with where we placed our expectations and where the situation is. Before this moment, I think, just to take a step back, the law never had the potential to stop this, to regulate Israel's behavior, to punish Israel's behavior. Had the law had that capacity, we wouldn't be here at 75 years. 75 years of settler colonial removal, of killing with impunity, state violence. We wouldn't be 2 years out after, you know, legacy human rights organizations find that there's finally apartheid overseen in a single jurisdiction from the river to the sea with zero accountability, and instead a move to normalize Israeli apartheid, right? If the law did what we think it's supposed to do, we wouldn't be here. So it's precisely the need to temper that expectation at the same time as understanding that that expectation is built up precisely because of the gravity of the situation, right? So how do you then explain that? And it's not just Palestine. Like, for anybody who yes, Palestine is definitely, I would say, emblematic of the worst condition of what law doesn't do. But even for those folks who just want to think about, what did law do to stem settler colonial removal on Turtle Island? International law. What has international law done to hold, you know, the Bush administration or the Obama administration, you know, liable for torture, detention, egregious violation, you know, aggression against the state of Iraq, right? That's a core crime in the Rome Statute. Or even against state violence against Black communities in the United States, where human rights should be triggered. The Convention Against Torture should be triggered. The Convention on the Rights of the Child should be triggered. So all of that to say, I still, all that, you know, and I could see how that would then undergird, Thomas, the folks who believe, well, then international law is nothing but a fig leaf for power if it can't do any of this work, and so yet we're compliant with it and are still working in that realm. So why? Because the law also has the capacity to function as a tool, and does function as a tool, and has functioned as a tool even for the most weak, including the Palestinians in the 1970s, who, when they had and still have, right, no standing army, no state representation, were able to enter into the UN, right, to condemn Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination, to assert the juridical status of the Palestinian people, which had been erased in the Balfour Declaration and the Palestine Mandate of 1922, and again in Resolution 242 in 1967 and 338 in 1973, to affirm that juridical status and to work with the non-aligned movement to basically raise the status of guerrillas from criminal terrorists to combatants, soldiers with the right to fight. They did that. They did that. So how do you, so that's why we still believe in the law and use it. But it's about understanding the law relationship to power. Law is power. Law is power. And in order to be wielded for the purpose of emancipatory struggles, it has to be done so in the sophisticated service of political movements. The law doesn't do anything unto itself. It's only functioning as a tool, and it's only as strong as the political movement that undergirds it. And so I've said in the book, and I'll say here again, think of the law like the sail of the boat. The boat won't move without the sail, but we don't know what direction it moves. The direction it moves is contingent on the wind, and the wind is politics. So, draw the sail when the politics are blowing in your direction, or raise the sail when it's moving in your direction, draw the sail when it's moving against you, create a new sail when you can, right? And this moment is no different. And so I don't condemn the law as merely a site of oppression, right? This very two-dimensional approach. It's crap because it's not working. It's not doing what it's supposed to do because it's still working as a tool. The reason I wanted to participate in the ICC case, even though I know that the ICC inherently upholds white supremacy in the Rome Statute, right? Is because as a result of filing that petition, we created controversy. We created controversy. This was a headline. Now this gets to be a debate. Now we get to intervene and advance what the people were saying in the streets now on, in different language amongst different audiences. Or even the reason the ICJ decision, I think at the later stage of proceedings, at the merit stage, the ICJ is unlikely to find that Israel is committing genocide based on the Serbia versus Bosnia jurisprudence. And yet I do believe in it because we were able to get the provisional orders that we got, which are necessary to achieve a ceasefire. Even if it's not achieving punishment, it's another tool to achieve ceasefire. And we've seen that it's functioning as another tool. Right? Why isn't it doing what it's supposed to be doing? Because the US still has veto power at the Security Council. The law is not going to overturn these structures of power. But we also saw a number of heads of state shift gears and now are for ceasefire, right? We saw, this includes, and now I'm off the top of my head to know which ones shifted. I think Australia was certainly one of the countries that shifted, but we also saw several countries that also engaged in weapons sanctions against Israel. That includes a Japanese military firm, that included Belgium of not, selling weapons transfers, that includes the Netherlands and F-35 parts, that includes seeing Nicaragua, Germany for its continued support of Israel. We saw Mexico and Chile participate in an ICC decision. So, okay, fine, the law didn't stop the genocide, but look at what the law did. It now created this language and this legitimacy that gave greater political space in order to isolate Israel and the United States, because this is a US war on Palestinians, not just one of complicity. And it gave room for other, states to shift gears because they understand they too can be complicit. And so here, think of the law for its utility. We're using it probably in not a straightforward way. You're not suing someone in order to get, an outcome. It becomes a battle and a battleground on which, we can expand and shape the terms of the battle.
Yeah, thank you, Nora. I'm gonna have to curb my desire to nerd out on asking you more about your book and focus more on what you're relaying us at this current moment. But I deeply appreciate that the contradictions you're describing, particularly as a legal practitioner and a teacher of the law as well, because I think that for those who are maybe outside of the legal bar and who are not familiar with how the international legal bar works, they may be, a lot of us are wondering, like, how did South Africa even work up this case? Like, what were the conversations that have? What are the political discussions? And a lot of what you sort of relayed also talks about not only the conversations that happen on the front end, but also like the conversations that then ensue, how countries make these strategic decisions to sort of engage in the larger politics that happen around legal interventions. And I'm wondering, given some of what you've hinted a little bit at some of this, but what should we expect next at the ICJ, or with the ICC, or even how that might
Sure.
affect the Security Council? I mean, what's the legal strategy at this point in time? And I know you've used this term of legal opportunities, but are there remaining legal opportunities or interventions that we haven't seen to stop the genocide, to secure a permanent ceasefire, and at the very least ensure Palestinian human rights?
Sure. No, great question. So let me just say, in terms of the ICJ, in the immediate short term, South Africa has now filed its second petition for updated provisional orders, given what Israel has blatantly disregarded after the 30-day period, blatantly disregarded any of its provisional orders. And so South Africa has asked once for new provisional orders right before, what we see as an impending invasion of Rafah. Israel, the ICJ responded and said, we just think they need to, abide by the provisional orders we already have. There's no need for new ones. They've now submitted a new application, basically saying, yes, but now you have starving children. Whatever provisional orders you provided are insufficient in order to alleviate suffering. This idea of just complying, because war happens, right? This is the thing. War is ugly. War happens, right? But we haven't had centuries of war to get to a point now where where states don't know how to fight it more humanely, right? Which is an oxymoron, right? You want to fight humanely. We're still killing it, but even think we regulate the way we slaughter animals for consumption, right? Even those things that we think are grotesque have some parameters. And the fact that here we are in 2024, where children, babies, are being starved to death, should indicate to audiences this is not merely because we don't have regulations or all wars are ugly, or even when Israel tries to say this is our Dresden. Yeah, Dresden preceded the Second World War, and an entire post-1945 chapter defined by human rights and recognition of individuals as rights-bearing agents under international law, right? And so here's what's so at concern, that you're supposed to have humanitarian corridors. There should be, the civilians should be spared. They are never to be objects of attack. And yet Israel has precisely made them the objects of attack, which is why South Africa is going back to the ICJ and saying, you think Israel is actually, taking this seriously, a good faith actor, that if you told them just provide the humanitarian access that they would. And yet here's what's going on. And so we'll see what happens on that front. At the ICC, I do not have a lot of faith. The ICC is a whole lecture on just how biased it is and how structurally problematic it is, right? It enshrines European superiority. Not just by coincidence is it that since 2002, only African and Arab heads of states have been indicted, right? With the exception of Slobodan Milosevic. It's meant to be that way. And we can, I would walk you through the text of the statute. I'm not going to do that. The Palestinians brought their petition to accede to the Rome Statute in 2015, right? In the aftermath of the 2014 offensive on Gaza. It took 6 years for the prosecutor at that time, Fatou Bensouda, to even recognize that Palestine had jurisdiction, even though by 2012 they'd been recognized by the majority of the General Assembly members that they were a state. It shouldn't have taken that long, and yet it did. And now under this prosecutor, Karim Khan, who is so problematic that in the 2 years between 2021 and 2023, not only didn't open up any of the files, right? But then his first visit to the region is at the invitation of the families of the survivors of the October 7th operation. I mean, and then, but we knew that. In 2015, I published an article and said, if the ICC mobilizes, it will prosecute Hamas members first. And in fact, that is what they're going to do. And I think that the ICC is going to mobilize, but it's going to mobilize in a very equivocating way. to basically say Hamas is committing war crimes, Israel is committing war crimes, and the primary war crime that they're going to highlight for Israel is using, starvation as a weapon of war, as opposed to going after, the most significant crime of genocide, right? And so not a lot to expect there except for what we can do politically and as a matter of controversy. And what about the other, you say legal opportunity. So I just want to be clear. I draw legal opportunity from the work. I combine the work of Duncan Kennedy and Rob Knox, and where Duncan Kennedy tells us, there's something called legal work, where, it doesn't matter what the law says. It matters what the actors do. So what are the lawyers? How are they litigating? What's the evidence that's being forwarded? What's the political, the political atmosphere like? What's the judge doing who's adjudicating this case? And political opportunity, which is basically taking advantage of, it's being an opportunist. You're taking advantage of a political moment in order to advance a purpose. And so I combine these to think legal opportunity. We are taking advantage of a moment where the world is literally being reorganized. Like, we are seeing a radical shift overnight, a generational shift. And in this moment, what are the opportunities that can be used in order to advance the Palestinian cause? Well, some of it is what, really creative lawyer. Now, what I think the greatest thing that we can do is for domestic lawyers to bring on cases, much like the foreign minister of South Africa, Pandor, announced would be the prosecution of all South Africans who served in the Israeli army at this point. But that's not only happening in South Africa, although it's not been announced at that top level. Lawyers are preparing similar cases like that against dual nationals in Britain, in Denmark, in Chile, in Malaysia. I mean, there's not going to be dual nationals in Malaysia, but these lawyers are preparing themselves. So I think that those are going to be the most advantageous cases, but we still see CCR is pursuing its case. Their appeal is going to be heard likely in early June in the Ninth Circuit. And so don't hold your breath. Nobody should be holding their breath. Don't wait for the law to save us. It's not. But what we're doing in what these lawyers and actors and advocates are doing in the legal sphere is basically to advance the political work being done on the ground. And I've said this, I don't think the Republic of South Africa would have necessarily brought its case had there not been a global movement of millions that made this an issue, right? And so it's not that the law is doing something for us. It's the people who are creating the opportunity for the legal workers to do something on their behalf in order to use those as tools and avenues. But, if we were to dismiss the law right now, Thomas, you might as well dismiss government, because that doesn't function. There's no representative government. You certainly would dismiss the media, because the media is a bunch of, propagandists who can't even do their job of reporting accurately and asking questions, right? You might want to dismiss the academy because you can't learn anything. Now you get in trouble for wanting to even provide context, right? So the same critique that we might level at the law, you can level at almost every other sphere. It would lead us into this place of surrender. We would surrender all the tools. We wouldn't surrender in terms of our resistance, but we would surrender all these tools that are available to us in these different spheres. I think the reason people are more angry at the law, right, is because there's more expectation there. And there, I would just say we shouldn't have had that expectation to begin with.
Yeah, no, and I think understanding all of these sites of struggle, I think you've also said in a different interview, you've talked about the other whole different side of struggle, which is the media battle, right? And the media terrain, and how all these different sites of struggle are kind of engaged with one another. Is probably the more material assessment to have in terms of how to structure our strategies. I wanted to shift a little bit in, the time we have left, and maybe ask you a final question that is looking a little bit more further ahead. I know that not only in your book but in your other conversations, you've been painstaking in documenting the kind of periods in which international law and international agreements have sort of shaped and reshaped the conflict. And Samara and I have been trying to make sense of the ceasefire negotiations, which is difficult given the amount of misinformation or disinformation or lack of information available. But given your historical understanding of past agreements brokered or foisted upon Palestinians by the international community, what do you expect is at the crux of the current negotiations? And are there specific concerns or considerations you have about the impact of a potential ceasefire agreement on Palestinian human rights and the prospect of autonomy or even sovereignty for Palestinians long term? Because it's such a moment of dire need to end the conflict. But these concerns are also there, hanging in the balance.
I mean, my whole discussion, like everybody who wants to discuss these political solutions, there's two ways I want to answer this, right? Number one, in any situation without a genocide, discussing politics without describing the foundation upon which those politics are built makes no sense. So that, we think, what is the equation that makes this work, as if we just can't figure out how to share the land, when the issue is not about necessarily sharing or belonging on the land, but is literally about the idea that Palestinians are inferior and therefore must basically accept whatever they're offered, even this autonomy framework that they're offered. Even when, Israel says, well, you can live here, as they've been told, you have three choices. You can live here as civilian, non-entities, a non-national group. You can leave or you can be killed, right? And so the idea here, I think when we get to that political solution, we need to think that political solution, which, ultimately is the question about Palestinian self-determination and how we envision it, needs to be built on a foundation of just basic rights that cannot be negotiated, right? What is it that cannot be negotiated? You cannot make torture legal. You can't make slavery legal. You can't make genocide legal, right? But you also cannot have to negotiate how much water you have. I mean, there's basic tenets of access to water, of indigenous sovereignty, of dignity, of self-determination. I mean, the Nakba is at its core, as we're reminded by Rabbi Ghabriya, an usurpation of our right to self-determination, not merely the usurpation of our land, but the right to be a nation as a whole on that land. And then in this situation, the other issue that we really have to take into consideration is we're not going to leapfrog into a political situation when now we have a genocide and an entire generation that was subject to it and is continuing to be subject to it on this day 160, where they're still subject to it. And just imagine that the moment that it's over, it's like, okay, let's let water be, water under the bridge, and let's move on and figure out how we're going to arrange ourselves politically. Absolutely not. Palestinians need accountability. They need a hearing meaning they need the opportunity to tell their stories and to be heard. This needs to be, as a point, accepted as a genocide without controversy, right? We're not done. We might agree in our circles, right? But, just as with all, post-fascist societies, the election of a democratic government isn't the end of fascism. It doesn't disappear. You have to continue to fight that battle. And so there is a battle that will need to continue to be fought. This is a genocide. Palestinians are survivors. They deserve restitution and reparation. They deserve accountability. And then the world has to deal with Israeli fascism. This is not just a bad government, as Schumer tried to indicate yesterday, and this pile up on Netanyahu that they're just thought of, right? This is state and society. You have a fascist society that celebrates and is giddy about the murder of Palestinians with advanced weapons technology. And so who's going to live with them? What kind of political solution just expects Palestinians? Please live with a fascist society that believes that your killing was their sovereign right, where they were supported by Western governments with funding weapons and impunity. And yet, go ahead now, arrange yourselves politically. Nobody would live with I don't know anybody that would be able to live with them in that society or with any fascist society. And in fact, if we don't deal with this, it encourages fascism everywhere as a model of sovereignty. And the Hindutvas certainly agree with that. White nationalists certainly agree with that, right? They're not the only, there's people who do believe that Israel is creating a model of their own sovereignty, which means like, and if we don't have accountability, that is the lesson that they learn.
Thank you so much for you joining us today. I know everyone at AROC and APTP and Bay Resistance, and of course at CP, we really appreciate your leadership in this movement and the work you're undertaking to politically educate the public and engage in that battlefield of media that we know is most likely not rejuvenating as a task to undertake on a regular basis. But we just want to thank you for joining, and please come back anytime.
Thank you for having me, and I promise next time will be longer. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Nura.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, everyone.